The moment I saw my private property sign floating down the creek like some sad little paper boat, I knew two things right away. One, somebody had been on my land again, and two, this wasn't going to end quietly. I just didn't realize yet how far it would go, or how many people were about to get dragged into it. My name's Caleb Turner, and about a year before all this started, I bought what I thought was the perfect piece of land just outside Asheville, North Carolina. Not huge, not fancy, just a modest house tucked behind a line of trees with a narrow creek cutting through the back edge of the property. That creek was the whole reason I bought it. According to the deed, I had full creek rights, meaning that stretch of water from the old wooden bridge down to a crooked oak tree about 50 yards south legally belonged to me. Not shared, not community access mine. I could fish there, sit there, do absolutely nothing there if I wanted, and no one else had any say in it. Now, right next to my property was this neighborhood called Ridge Hollow Estates, the kind with an HOA that liked to remind people it existed every chance it got. Technically, my land sat just outside their boundary line, which at the time felt like a blessing. I wasn't part of their rules, didn't have to deal with their meetings, didn't have to ask permission to paint my mailbox or plant tomatoes. Or at least, that's what I thought. The first time I met their HOA president, her name was Diane Mercer, she walked up my driveway like she owned the place. Clipboard in hand, oversized sunglasses, the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She introduced herself, welcomed me to the area, then within 30 seconds pointed out that my shed might not meet community aesthetic standards. I remember just standing there, holding a box of kitchen supplies, thinking, lady, I don't even live here yet. That was my first hint that Diane didn't really care where her authority ended. Over the next couple months, little things started happening. Notes left on my door about non-compliant landscaping, emails about community expectations, even though I'd never signed a single HOA document. At first I ignored it, figured she was just one of those people who needed to feel important. But then the notes turned into warnings, and the warnings started mentioning fines. That's when I pushed back. I printed a copy of my deed, highlighted the property lines, and the next time she showed up, I handed it to her. I said, real calm, Diane, I'm not part of your HOA. You don't have authority over my land. She glanced at the paper, barely even reading it, and just waved her hand like I'd told her the sky was green. We'll see about that, she said, and walked off. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Fast forward a few weeks, early spring, the kind of day where the air still has a bite to it, but you can feel summer trying to push through. I walked down toward the creek with a cup of coffee, just planning to sit for a bit, and that's when I saw the sign. My sign. The one I'd staked near the bank that said private property, no trespassing. It had been pulled up, tossed into the water, and was slowly drifting downstream like it didn't belong anywhere anymore. I followed it along the edge, boots sinking into the damp soil, and then I heard voices. Laughter. Music, faint but steady, like someone had brought a speaker. I rounded the bend near the oak tree and just stopped. There they were. Diane, sitting in a folding chair like she was on vacation, a fishing rod in one hand, a plastic cup in the other. Next to her were two other HOA board members, a guy named Rick and a woman named Paula. Both of them kicked back like this was their personal getaway spot. There was a cooler between them, a Bluetooth speaker playing some smooth jazz nonsense, and 3 fishing lines cast right into my creek. For a second, I honestly thought I'd walked into the wrong place. Like maybe I'd taken a wrong turn on my own land. I cleared my throat, louder than necessary. Diane turned slowly, like she'd been expecting me, and that same practiced smile slid onto her face. Caleb, she said, all sweet and fake. Beautiful day, isn't it? I didn't smile back. You're on my property. Paula let out this little laugh, like I'd just told a joke. Oh, come on, it's just a creek. Yeah, I said, stepping closer. A creek that belongs to me. Diane set her cup down, crossed one leg over the other, completely unfazed. Well, the board voted last month to open this area for community use. We felt it would benefit the neighborhood. I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. You voted to open land you don't own? She shrugged. It's adjacent to the community. These things get integrated. No, I said, sharper this time, they don't. That's not how property law works. Rick chimed in then, not even looking at me, just reeling in his line. You're not using it all the time anyway, man. Why not let people enjoy it? That did it. Something in my chest tightened. Not just anger, but that kind of disbelief where you realize someone genuinely thinks they're right. How long have you been coming down here? Diane hesitated, just for a second, then said, a few weeks. A few weeks. I nodded slowly, like I understood, but inside my head, everything shifted. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was routine. I didn't argue anymore. Didn't raise my voice, didn't threaten anything. I just turned around and walked back up toward the house, leaving them there with their fishing lines and their drinks and their absolute certainty that they could do whatever they wanted. Because the moment she said, a few weeks, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. See, when I first bought the place, I installed cameras along the back lot. Not because I expected trouble, just peace of mind. They covered the creek, the tree line, the path leading down from the road. I hadn't checked them in a while, not since winter, but now I had a reason. I stepped into the kitchen, set my coffee down, and pulled up the feed on my laptop. The system took a second to load, buffering like it was deciding whether to ruin my day or not. Then the footage came through, and I swear, I felt my stomach drop. Because it wasn't just Diane in her folding chair. It was a whole lot worse. The first clip that loaded looked harmless enough at a glance. Just Diane and two others walking down toward the creek, laughing, carrying chairs like they were setting up for a picnic. But then I started scrubbing through the timeline, going back a few days, then a week, then two, and that's when the pattern showed itself. Not random visits, not occasional trespassing, but something organized, repeated, almost intentional. I leaned in closer to the screen, one hand gripping the edge of the counter, and hit play on a clip from about 3 weeks earlier. That's when I saw the chainsaw. Diane wasn't holding it. Of course, that would have been too on the nose, but standing right beside her was Rick and another guy I recognized from the neighborhood. Tall, gray beard, always wore those cargo shorts like he was ready for a camping trip at any moment. He pulled the cord, the engine kicked, and within seconds they were cutting into one of the dogwood trees right near the bend of the creek, my tree. I actually said no out loud, like somehow that would reach back in time and stop it, but the footage kept rolling, steady and indifferent. The tree came down in under 5 minutes, clean cut, deliberate. Then they dragged the trunk a few feet and positioned it like a bench, like they were improving the place. I paused the video, just sat there for a second, staring at the screen, feeling that slow burn crawl up the back of my neck. That wasn't trespassing anymore. That was damage. Permanent, deliberate damage. But it didn't stop there. 2 days later, another clip, same group, this time carrying bags. Gravel. They dumped it along the muddy path leading down to the creek, spreading it out with shovels, packing it down like they were building a proper walkway. Diane even stepped back at one point, hands on her hips, nodding like she was supervising a construction site. I couldn't help it. I let out this short, humorless laugh. The audacity of it was almost impressive. Then came the part that really got me. A clip from a Saturday afternoon, bright sunlight, shadows short, and there were kids, at least 5 or 6 of them, splashing in the creek, yelling, chasing each other through the water while the adults sat back in their chairs with drinks in hand. No supervision worth anything, no regard for safety, just using it like it was theirs. One kid slipped at one point, went under for a second, and my heart jumped even though I knew he came back up fine. Still, that was enough. That right there crossed into something else entirely. I leaned back in my chair, exhaled slow, and just said it out loud, to nobody. You've got to be kidding me. Because now it wasn't just about me anymore. If one of those kids had gotten hurt on my land in water I legally owned, I'd be the one dealing with it. Not Diane. Not the HOA. Me. I didn't waste time after that. I started exporting clips, pulling still images, making sure every frame had timestamps visible. The system I'd set up stored everything locally, encrypted, not something you could just tamper with. And for the first time since installing it, I felt genuinely grateful I'd gone overboard. I printed out screenshots, labeled them, stacked them neatly on the kitchen table like I was building a case, because that's exactly what I was doing. Then I made 2 calls. The first was to a friend of mine, Laura Bennett, someone I'd met a couple years back when I helped her with a small property dispute involving a contractor. She'd been a county prosecutor before switching over to real estate law, and she had this way of speaking that made you feel like everything was already under control, even when it absolutely wasn't. When she picked up, I didn't bother with small talk. I just said, "Hey Laura, I think I've got a situation." I explained everything, from the HOA nonsense to what I'd just seen on the footage, and there was a pause on the line, not confusion, not disbelief, just processing. Then she said, calm and measured, "Caleb, do not confront them again. Save everything. We're going to handle this properly." That word, properly, stuck with me. The second call was to the sheriff's office. By mid-afternoon, Deputy Collins was standing in my kitchen, watching the footage on my laptop. He didn't say much at first, just crossed his arms, leaned slightly forward, eyes tracking every movement on the screen. When the chainsaw clip ended, he let out a low whistle, almost under his breath. "Yeah, that's not good. That's my tree," I said. He nodded. "And that," he added, pointing as the gravel scene played, "that's unauthorized land alteration. And kids," he shook his head slightly, "that opens up a whole other set of problems." I looked at him. "Can you cite them?" He glanced at me, then back at the screen, then said something I didn't expect. "We're past citations. This could be criminal trespass, property damage, maybe more, depending on how far you want to take it." There it was, the line in the sand. "You want to press charges?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. "Yeah, I do." He gave a small nod, like he'd been waiting for that answer. "All right then, I'll start the report. You'll get a case number by tomorrow morning." After he left, the house felt different. Same walls, same furniture, but the air had shifted. Like something had been set in motion that wasn't going to stop easily. That night, Laura called me back. "I reviewed the deed you sent," she said, getting straight to it. "Your boundary is solid. That creek section is unquestionably yours. And Caleb, it gets better." "Better how?" "You're not in their HOA." I blinked, even though she couldn't see me. "I know that." "No," she said, a hint of something sharper in her tone now. "I mean legally. Your parcel was never included in their jurisdiction. They have zero authority over you. None. Those notices they sent, the warnings, any fines they've implied, that's not just overreach. That could be considered fraudulent." I leaned back against the counter, letting that sink in. "So they've been what? Pretending they have power they don't actually have." "Exactly." I let out a slow breath, then couldn't help it. I smiled, not out of joy, but that kind of satisfaction you get when the pieces start falling into place. "So what do? We hit them from both sides," she said. "Criminal, through the sheriff's report. Civil, through a lawsuit. Trespass, property damage, unauthorized construction, and we include their attempt to assert authority over non-member property. That part's going to hurt them." "Do it," I said. The next morning, I drove down to the courthouse, paperwork in hand, and filed everything we'd prepared. It felt surreal, standing there at the counter, handing over documents that basically said, in legal terms, you picked the wrong property to mess with. By that afternoon, I was back down at the creek. The rope swing they'd installed hung from a low branch, swaying slightly in the breeze like it didn't know it was evidence in an active case. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked the path they'd built, every step a reminder of how far they'd gone. I took photos of everything, the stump where my tree used to be, the makeshift bench, the scattered trash someone had left behind. A crushed beer can sat half buried near the bank, and I picked it up, turning it over in my hand before dropping it into a bag. It wasn't just damage. It was entitlement. Pure, unchecked entitlement. 2 days later, the citations were served. I didn't see it happen, but I heard about it almost immediately. News travels fast in places like that, faster than you'd expect. I was unloading groceries when my neighbor, Tom, a retired mechanic who'd lived in the area longer than anyone, wandered over with his dog trailing behind him. "Caleb," he said, lowering his voice like we were about to discuss something classified, "you really had the sheriff serve Diane?" "Yeah," I said, setting a bag down. "I did." He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Heard she tried to argue with the deputy like he was a waiter who got her order wrong." That made me laugh, genuinely this time. "Sounds about right." He looked past me toward the tree line, then back at me. About time someone stood up to them. That was the first time I realized this wasn't just my fight. That evening, a couple more neighbors stopped by. A young couple from down the road brought over a pie, said they'd been dealing with HOA nonsense for months. A nurse named Karen told me she'd been threatened with daily fines over where she parked her car, even though it didn't violate any actual city code. Story after story, all variations of the same thing: pressure, intimidation, rules that didn't quite exist. So I started organizing it. I created a folder on my computer, labeled it simply HOA, and inside it I began sorting everything: my footage, my documents, and now their stories. Screenshots of emails, copies of notices, photos people had taken. It grew faster than I expected. By the weekend, it had turned into something bigger than just evidence. It was a record, and that record was about to cause a lot more damage than a single cut tree ever could. By the time the HOA called their emergency meeting that weekend, I already knew how it was going to play out. Not because I was guessing, but because people had started talking, really talking, not just complaining behind closed doors, but comparing notes, lining up timelines, realizing they weren't the only ones who'd been pushed around. And once that kind of realization spreads through a neighborhood, it doesn't go back in the box. I didn't go to the meeting myself. I wasn't a member, remember, at least not in any way that actually mattered. But Laura did. She went in as my legal representative, carrying a stack of folders thick enough to make a statement before she even said a word. Later that night, she called me. "You should have seen her face," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Diane tried to start the meeting like everything was normal, went straight into community concerns and maintaining standards, and then I handed out the packets. "What was in them?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Everything," she said. "The footage, the deed, the boundary maps, the sheriff's report, and a formal notice outlining their lack of jurisdiction over your property. I also included a warning: any further action against you would be considered harassment." I leaned against the kitchen counter, picturing it. Diane, standing there with that clipboard, that same confident posture, and then watching it crack. "She didn't take it well," Laura added. "I can imagine. She tried to argue, said the board had the authority to act in the best interest of the community. I told her, you can't redefine someone else's property as your community asset just because it's convenient." That line stuck with me, because that's exactly what they'd been doing. The fallout started almost immediately. By Monday morning, one of the board members had resigned. By Tuesday, another one was considering stepping down. People who had been quiet for months suddenly weren't anymore. Emails started circulating, screenshots, forwarded messages, questions nobody had dared to ask before. And then the sheriff's office followed through. Formal charges: trespass, property damage, unauthorized land alteration, endangerment because of the kids. The total fines alone were high enough to make anyone think twice. But what really hit them was this: they couldn't pay it with HOA funds. Every dollar had to come out of their own pockets. That's when the tone shifted. What had started as arrogance turned into panic. But it didn't stop there. Because once the county got involved, they didn't just look at my case, they started looking at everything. An inspector showed up a few days later, walked the perimeter of my land, checked the creek, took notes, asked a few questions. Then he pointed something out I hadn't even noticed. A section of the HOA's community garden. It extended past their boundary line. Not by much, maybe 20 feet, but enough. "That's county land," he said. "They're not supposed to be there." I just nodded. At that point, nothing surprised me anymore. Within a week, it escalated. Code enforcement showed up, then environmental officials. Apparently, the gravel they'd dumped near my creek had disrupted a protected runoff channel. I hadn't even filed that complaint, someone else had. Turned out one of the neighbors, a retired biology teacher named Walter, had been documenting issues like that for months, just waiting for something solid to tie it all together. "Well," he told me one afternoon, adjusting his hat as we stood near the creek, "they finally gave me something." And he wasn't wrong. The HOA got hit with a cease and desist order, banning any further land modifications. Their lawyer, the one who'd been backing them through all of this, officially withdrew not long after, citing incomplete disclosure of material facts. That's a polite way of saying they lied. Then came the part nobody saw coming: the financial records. Once the state started digging, it didn't take long to find inconsistencies. Payments approved for equipment that didn't exist, reimbursements that traced back to relatives, expenses labeled vaguely enough to avoid questions, until someone actually started asking. Diane's name showed up more than once. So did Rick's. And when that information made its way to the Attorney General's office, things moved fast. Diane was arrested 2 weeks later. No dramatic chase, no sirens, just 2 cruisers pulling up early in the morning, quiet, efficient. She walked out of her house in a robe, still trying to argue, still trying to maintain that same authority she'd carried for months, but it didn't land the same anymore. Rick followed not long after. Watching it all unfold felt strange. Not satisfying, not exactly. More like watching a structure collapse that you hadn't realized was holding up so much tension. Once it started falling, everything around it shifted. Meanwhile, my case moved through the civil side. Laura handled most of it, but she kept me in the loop. We went after everything: the tree, the damage, the legal fees, even the stress of dealing with it all. The judge didn't take long to rule. Full compensation. And more importantly, a formal order requiring the HOA to publicly clarify their jurisdiction boundaries. In other words, they had to admit, in writing, that they never had authority over my land. That part mattered more than the money. But the real turning point came at a community gathering a few weeks later. Not an official HOA meeting, just neighbors. People brought chairs, food, set up in the open space near the entrance to the neighborhood. It wasn't planned as anything big, just a chance to talk without all the formal structure. I didn't plan on speaking. I showed up, stood near the edge, listened. People shared stories, some small, some not. Fines that didn't make sense, rules that changed depending on who you were, pressure that had built slowly over time. Then someone mentioned my situation, and suddenly people were looking at me. I hesitated for a second, then stepped forward. Not because I had a speech ready, but because it felt like I should say something. I didn't want this to turn into what it did, I said, keeping my voice steady. I just wanted to be left alone on my own property. There were a few nods. But when someone starts acting like they can take something that isn't theirs and nobody pushes back, it doesn't stop there. It got quiet then. I'm not saying I handled everything perfectly, I added. But I know this: if we let things slide just to keep the peace, eventually there won't be any peace left to keep. Nobody clapped right away. It wasn't that kind of moment. But the silence, it felt like agreement. Over the next month, the HOA unraveled completely. Board members resigned, one after another. The remaining ones tried to hold things together, but without leadership, without trust, it didn't work. Eventually, a vote was held, and the HOA was dissolved. Not restructured, not rebranded, dissolved. No more fines. No more surprise notices. No more pretending authority existed where it didn't. The neighborhood changed after that. You could feel it, not in some dramatic way, but in the small things. People waved more. Conversations lasted longer. The tension that had been sitting just under the surface, it faded. As for me, I went back to the creek. I replaced the tree they cut with a young dogwood, planted it right near the same spot, cleared out the gravel, restored the bank as best I could, built a simple wooden bench, nothing fancy, just something solid where I could sit and watch the water move. One evening, a couple months after everything settled, I stood there as the sun dipped low, the light catching the surface of the creek just right. No voices, no music, no folding chairs that didn't belong, just quiet. Real quiet. And for the first time in a long while, it felt earned. But here's the thing. A few weeks after that, I got a letter from the county. Certified mail. Said my property had been flagged for a reassessment. Something about unreported structures near the creek. There was even a photo attached, blurry, taken from above. Problem was, I didn't build anything. And the structure in that photo wasn't on my land. So now I'm standing there again, at the edge of that same creek, holding a piece of paper that tells me someone is still trying to use my property for something I didn't approve. Which makes me wonder, did this really end? Or did it just change shape? So I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you keep pushing, dig deeper, make sure every last piece of this gets exposed? Or would you finally let it go, take the win, and walk away? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because honestly, I'm not sure this story's over yet.